December 16th, 1945. The war was over, yet its shadows still gripped the hearts of those who had fought, served, or simply survived. On that frost-bitten Sunday morning in Iowa, a small truck rattled down a gravel road toward a white clapboard church whose bell tolled into the winter air. Inside the truck sat a group of young Slovak women prisoners of war taken months earlier in Bavaria. Among them was Maria Kovachova, barely 20, once a radio operator for a German signals unit. Propaganda had prepared her for torment. Back home she had been told that capture meant degradation, that Americans would mock them, starve them, maybe parade them in chains. Her stomach was tight with fear, her hands buried in the scratchy wool of a military blanket that smelled faintly of mothballs and disinfectant. She braced for hatred, expecting angry townsfolk to spit or jeer as she climbed down from the truck. Instead, as the church doors opened, she caught the unexpected fragrance of cinnamon and coffee drifting up from the basement kitchen. The sight of families filing into pews, the calm nod of a farmer in his Sunday coat, and the shy glance of a child clutching a hymn book struck her harder than any blow. Confusion clouded her mind. Why were they being led, not into a cell, but into a sanctuary? In that moment, Maria's terror wavered. Something impossible was unfolding. She asked herself silently, and trembling, was this kindness genuine, or was it the cruelest trick of all? The journey that had brought Maria Kovachova to this strange, bewildering Sunday in Iowa had begun 7 months earlier on the crumbling edges of a collapsing Reich. It was May 8, 1945, the official end of the war in Europe, yet for her and hundreds of other auxiliary women scattered across Bavaria, surrender did not feel like liberation. It felt like humiliation. Maria and her companions, Slovak women attached to German units as clerks, radio operators, and nurses, had been herded into the muddy schoolyard of a small Bavarian village by American troops. Their weapons were already gone. Even their armbands had been stripped away. For hours they stood beneath a grey, unsettled sky, expecting at any moment to be screamed at, beaten, or worse. Instead, the first shock came in silence. The Americans' boys, really some younger than her own brothers, spoke little, only gesturing them into lines, noting down names, issuing numbered tags. Then came the powder, a thick, chalky spray of delousing chemicals over hair, skin, and clothing. Maria coughed, her eyes burning. She thought it a punishment, a degradation, yet the soldier applying it only muttered, "Necessary, miss," before moving to the next prisoner. Later, someone handed her a small bar of soap wrapped in brown paper. Soap, real soap with a faint lemon scent. She hadn't seen such luxury in years. For a moment she held it in her palm as though it were a bomb. What game were they playing? Within days, she and dozens of other women were loaded onto trucks, then rail cars. At every stop, rumors multiplied. They would be forced to work in coal mines. They would be sent to scrub American latrines for life. They would be experimented on. By the time they were marched onto a converted Liberty ship at a northern French port in June, Maria's fear was so dense it had hardened into numbness. The Atlantic crossing was misery. The sea heaved, and the smell of oil mixed with vomit filled the holds where they slept. Hammocks creaked in the dark. At night she lay awake, listening to the thrum of engines and the whispered prayers of women who feared they would never see Europe again. Now and then, above the roar of the waves, came the laughter of American guards. It sounded cruel to her ears, not because the laughter was mocking, but because it was carefree. How could they laugh when the world lay in ruins? Then came the trains. After docking in New York, the women were packed into long, rattling cars bound for the heartland. Through narrow windows they glimpsed landscapes that seemed endless, neat towns, with white houses, fields of rippling corn factories that belched smoke even in peacetime. At one station, a group of American soldiers tossed cigarettes and apples into the car. Some women snatched them up. Others, like Maria, shrank back suspicious. Was this bribery propaganda? She clutched her ration biscuit tighter and muttered under her breath that she would never beg from the enemy. And then at last the camp. Surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by men with rifles slung casually across their shoulders, it should have looked like hell. Yet Maria's first impression was not of cruelty, but of order. The gravel paths between the barracks were swept. The grass, astonishingly, was trimmed. The women were led to a long wooden building where a sergeant, his accent slow and nasal, pointed them toward showers. Showers, real showers with hot water. Some wept as the steam rose. Others sang the sound echoing off the tiled walls. Maria scrubbed herself with the lemon soap until her skin burned, half expecting that once clean they would be beaten. Instead, clean uniforms were issued simple denim trousers, shirts and coats, stamped PW. She had dreaded the moment of being paraded in rags, her hair hacked off. Yet here she stood, dressed decently, her long braid intact, and no one laughed. The true shock, though, waited in the mess hall. The smell hit her first roasted meat onions, fresh bread. Her stomach clenched so hard she nearly doubled over. The women filed in, guided toward a steel counter where cooks in white aprons ladled food onto trays. When her turn came, Maria stared in disbelief. A thick stew, steaming and rich with carrots and beef. A slice of white bread, soft and warm. A square of yellow butter that glistened under the lights. For a moment she couldn't move. This had to be a trick. The cook, a stocky man with sweat shining on his brow, gave her a puzzled look. Then, to her astonishment, he smiled. "Eat," he said, simply sliding the tray closer. Her hands trembled as she carried it to a bench. Around her, other Slovak girls whispered in awe. Some laughed nervously, dipping bread into the stew as though they were at a feast. Maria stared down at the bowl, her mind racing. Propaganda had told her Americans were barbarians who despised prisoners, who lived only to humiliate the defeated. Yet here was hot food, served without mockery. Could it be poison? Could it be some elaborate psychological test? She forced herself to raise a spoon. The first sip seared her tongue. It tasted of salt and fat and life. She swallowed, and a warmth spread through her chest that was more frightening than any guard's rifle. For in that moment she realized she wanted more, and wanting, she thought, was the first step toward betrayal. That night, lying in a bunk with clean sheets tucked under her chin, she could not sleep. Every creak of the barracks, every distant shout made her stiffen, waiting for the cruelty to begin. Yet morning came with no whips, no jeers. Instead there was roll call, orderly and brisk, followed by another meal, oatmeal, milk, more bread. The days that followed deepened the confusion. Guards spoke politely. Work assignments were reasonable. Soap was provided again. When Maria caught herself humming as she hung her laundry on a line, she bit her lip until it bled. She told herself it was all a facade, a mask that would drop any moment. But the mask did not drop. And when weeks later a camp pastor approached with an unusual request that some of the women might attend Sunday service in town, Maria felt a new wave of fear rise inside her. Church was sacred. Church was home. Why would the Americans let prisoners walk into a sanctuary among families under the eyes of God himself? She remembered the cook's smile, the taste of butter on warm bread, and shivered. This was not the enemy she had been warned about. This was something far more dangerous, for cruelty was easy to resist. But kindness slipped past the defenses, seeped into the cracks of hunger and exhaustion, and planted doubts that gnawed at the soul. And so when the truck finally rolled toward that Iowa church on a winter morning, Maria's heart pounded not with fear of punishment, but with something even more terrifying, the fear that mercy might be real. Life in the camp unfolded with a rhythm that was at once alien and strangely comforting. For Maria Kovacheva, the first weeks passed in a haze of disbelief. She had expected chaos, cruelty, the unpredictable violence of guards drunk on victory. Instead, each day began with a whistle at dawn, the roll call echoing across the frosty yard, names called in clipped accents that mangled Slovak syllables but carried no malice. The women stood shivering in their denim uniforms, their breath steaming in the cold, while American officers checked their lists. Then came breakfast, and with it the unsettling realization that hunger was no longer her constant companion. The barracks themselves were crude but orderly. Wooden bunks stacked in rows, each with a mattress sheets and a woolen blanket folded at the foot. A potbelly stove stood in the center, fed with logs that crackled and hissed. At night, the women whispered beneath the dim glow of a single bulb, conversations half in Slovak, half in German, their voices carrying the tremors of disbelief. Even the latrines, so often a place of shame and stench, were scrubbed, clean the air sharp, with the scent of disinfectant. To bathe in hot water twice a week felt like a miracle. To lather her hair with soap and watch the dirt swirl away was to reclaim some fragment of dignity she thought long lost. Everywhere the Americans seemed obsessed with order. Gravel paths raked smooth, grass trimmed neatly even behind barbed wire. Tools hung straight in workshops where prisoners were assigned to labor. Maria spent her mornings sorting vegetables for the camp kitchen, her hands moving automatically while her mind drifted to the ruins of her village back home. In Slovakia, her cousins stood in bread lines that stretched for blocks. Here, food was measured predictable, almost abundant. She resented it, yet her body welcomed it with every restored pound. The mess hall was the center of their days. Metal trays clattered on counters, the aroma of stew, cornbread, or beans filling the long hall. Once she caught herself smiling at the sight of a guard slipping a second biscuit to Zuzana, her closest friend. She forced the smile away. To show gratitude was dangerous, she told herself, a slippery slope toward forgetting. Still, the warmth of the food, the hum of conversation, the clang of cutlery, all these sounds burrowed into her heart, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. Work details varied. Some women mended uniforms, others stitched sacks, still others tended the small garden plots within the fence. Maria volunteered for the library detail. The library was a shack filled with donated paperbacks, dog-eared magazines, and a few Slovak Bibles sent by church groups. She touched the spines reverently, inhaling the musty scent of old paper. She could not yet read English, but the photographs in magazines fascinated her. Images of smiling families in tidy homes of cars, gleaming on wide roads of skyscrapers, piercing clouds. Was this real America or another illusion crafted for their eyes? Letters from home arrived sporadically, censored with black ink. Her mother's handwriting trembled across the page. Bread is scarce. The city is broken. Your cousin is gone. Maria read those words, until they blurred, until tears smudged the paper. She looked around the camp at full plates at soap bars, neatly stacked at shoes being resoled by a fellow prisoner who had once been a cobbler, and shame twisted inside her. Why did captivity offer more order than freedom? The women wrestled with such questions daily. Some embraced the routine, softening into laughter, singing in the evenings. Others hardened, whispering that it was all a trick, that Americans meant to rot their spirit with false kindness. Maria belonged to neither camp fully. She wanted to believe in her suspicion, yet each day chipped away at her certainty. One memory haunted her most, the night she had hidden bread crusts in her handkerchief, stuffing them into her pillow like a squirrel. She could not eat them later. They had gone hard, stale. Yet she kept them for weeks, a talisman against betrayal. To need their food was one thing, to trust it was another. The guards puzzled her. They carried rifles, yet seldom barked orders. Some nodded politely when passing. Others shared cigarettes with prisoners on work details. Once an older sergeant stopped to watch the women hanging laundry. He shook his head at the sight of steam rising from clean linens and muttered, "Better than France, eh?" The casual tone, the assumption that dignity mattered, unnerved her. She longed for the sharp lines of enemy and ally, for the clarity that war had once promised. This blurring, this greyness, frightened her more than guns. As autumn turned to winter, the air in the camp grew sharp and clear. Frost glittered on the barbed wire each morning, a cruel beauty that reminded her of home. The stove in the barracks roared, the women huddled together for warmth. Outside, rumours whispered of trials in Nuremberg, of borders redrawn, of families displaced. Inside, there was silence, a bubble of order removed from Europe's chaos. Then came the invitation. One afternoon, the camp chaplain, a tall man with thinning hair and kindly eyes, visited their barracks. Through an interpreter, he explained that local families had asked if a small group of women might attend Sunday service in town. Guards would escort them. There was no obligation. The barracks erupted in arguments. Some shouted that it was a trick, that humiliation awaited. Others whispered that they longed to step beyond the fence, even under guard. Maria listened in silence, her heart racing. Church had been the anchor of her childhood, candles flickering in a village nave, her mother's voice singing hymns. To sit again in a pew, even in an enemy's church, stirred something she had buried. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. She imagined American families staring at her with contempt. She imagined spit jeers, whispers of Nazi girl. Yet another part of her imagined warmth, the sound of an organ, the smell of candles, the taste of bread after service. She pressed her face into her pillow, ashamed of her longing. In the end, curiosity overcame fear. When the truck rolled out of the gate that Sunday morning, Maria climbed aboard, clutching her coat tight. The guards said little, their faces impassive. The countryside slid past bare trees etched against the sky farmhouses, with smoke rising from chimneys. She caught glimpses of children playing in yards, women carrying baskets of laundry. None pointed, none jeered. The world outside the fence looked startlingly ordinary. As the church steeple appeared on the horizon, her breath caught. This was no trick of propaganda, no photograph in a magazine. It was real wood, real stone, real people, gathering on a winter morning. And as the truck stopped, as the bell tolled across the fields, she felt her defenses falter. She was about to step not into captivity, but into something far more dangerous, the possibility of mercy. The truck jolted to a stop on the gravel, and the bell of the little white church tolled across the frozen fields. Maria stepped down, her boots crunching on the frost. Her breath plumed in the air, joining the faint smoke that drifted from chimneys nearby. She had expected silence, suspicion, maybe even stones thrown at her. Instead, she heard voices low, calm, welcoming as families filed through the church doors. Mothers in wool coats, fathers in worn suits, children tugging mittens. No one spat, no one pointed. They simply looked, some curious, some cautious, but not hateful. The guards remained at the door, rifles slung carelessly. For the first time in months, Maria crossed a threshold that was not marked by barbed wire. Inside, the warmth stunned her. The organ's first chords rolled through the nave, solemn yet gentle. The smell of candles and pine boughs filled the air. Advent wreaths glowed, one more candle lit as Christmas neared. An usher gestured toward a pew. The Millers, the farm family who had requested the visit, shifted to make space. Maria slid in beside them, heart hammering. She felt the wood beneath her hands, polished smooth by decades of worshippers. A small girl, no older than 8, handed her a hymn book. Maria stared at it blankly, the words foreign, incomprehensible. Yet when the singing began, she recognized the melody. It was the same hymn her mother had once hummed while kneading dough. Her throat tightened. Against her will, her lips moved, forming syllables in Slovak that echoed the American voices in English. Two worlds entwined in song, the service passed in a haze. She caught only fragments through the interpreter's whispers, forgiveness, peace, hope. But it was not the words that unsettled her. It was the tone. No triumph, no mockery of enemies, only the rhythm of a community that seemed determined to believe in mercy. As the final hymn faded, the pastor bowed his head. Then, to her disbelief, he invited them all to the basement for fellowship. The descent into the basement hall felt like stepping into another world. Long tables stretched beneath bare bulbs. Enamel mugs clinked as they were filled with steaming coffee. Platters of food lined the counter, cinnamon rolls golden and glistening, their sugar glaze shining in the light. White bread cut into neat triangles with a thick, creamy spread she did not recognize. At first, she froze suspicious. Then the smell enveloped her, sweet butter-roasted coffee cinnamon rising warm into her nostrils. Zuzana nudged her, whispering in awe, "It smells like home." Maria's stomach twisted violently. She had not tasted anything like this since before the war, before hunger became daily life. Yet fear coiled in her chest. What if this was the real trap? What if eating here at these tables, surrounded by Americans, meant surrendering not just her body, but her soul? Propaganda whispered in her ear, better to starve than to betray your people. A plate was placed in her hands by Mrs. Miller, the farm matron. The woman smiled, lines deepening around her eyes, and said softly, "Eat." The same word the camp cook had spoken weeks before. Simple, unadorned, impossible to ignore. On the plate lay a roll, still warm steam curling from its torn edge, and beside it a triangle of bread smeared with the mysterious spread. Peanut butter, Zuzana whispered, tasting hers with wide eyes. Sweet and salty, like nothing I've known. Maria stared at her plate, torn in two. If she ate, she risked betraying everything she had been taught. To accept food from the enemy was to accept their mercy, to admit they were not monsters. But to refuse was to betray her own hunger, her body crying out for nourishment, her memory aching for comfort. Her hands shook. She thought of her mother in Trnava flour, dusting her hands, kneading dough on a wooden table, humming the hymn she had just heard upstairs. She thought of winter nights before the war, when the smell of cinnamon rolls meant safety, family, love. She thought of the letters from home, ink smudged with grief, describing hunger and rubble. Here in this basement the air was thick with abundance. Her lips brushed a silent prayer. Then slowly she lifted the roll to her mouth. The first bite released sweetness onto her tongue, a softness that nearly undid her. Tears threatened her eyes. She forced them back, terrified to show weakness. She hated the relief that surged through her body, the warmth that spread as though her very soul was thawing. And yet she wanted another bite, and another. Around her, the other Slovak women ate cautiously, then hungrily. The Americans chatted, poured more coffee, passed plates, as though nothing were strange about sharing a meal with former enemies. The guards leaned against the wall, relaxed, unconcerned. The strangeness of it all pressed in on her like a weight. This was no punishment, no mockery. This was mercy, plain and disarming. She sipped the coffee. Bitter hot, it burned her tongue but flooded her with energy. She had never liked coffee at home. It had been rare, expensive. But here in this moment it tasted like belonging. She set the mug down and realized her hands were trembling, not from fear but from something more dangerous, gratitude. Inside, the war raged anew. Was she betraying her homeland by tasting kindness? Was every bite a nail driven into her loyalty? Or was refusing mercy the greater betrayal, a denial of her own humanity? She felt caught between two betrayals, both unbearable. When the meal ended, the pastor offered a closing blessing. Maria bowed her head mechanically, but inside her mind churned. Mercy, she realized, could be more powerful than violence. It slipped past every defense propaganda had built, melted the cold armor of hatred. It was in its way more dangerous than the whip. As they climbed back into the truck, her heart still pounding, she clenched her fists. She told herself it was just food, just bread and coffee. But deep down she knew it was more. It was the beginning of something she could not yet name, the unraveling of the lies she had once believed. The road back to camp rattled beneath the wheels. Outside, the fields stretched silent and empty. Inside, her chest ached with a new fear that the memory of sweetness, of mercy, of that shared hymn would never leave her. And perhaps she thought with dread and longing that was the true weapon the Americans wielded, not rifles, not bombs, but kindness, that broke the spirit's defenses more surely than any blade. The weeks after that Sunday service unfolded with a strange clarity. For Maria, every bite of cinnamon roll, every sip of black coffee lingered as an accusation. She had gone to church expecting humiliation, expecting to be paraded before Americans as an object of pity or scorn. Instead, she had been welcomed with song, with food, with the warmth of families who did not even speak her language. That memory gnawed at her more fiercely than hunger ever had. It was not the taste of butter or sugar that haunted her, but the realization that the world outside the Reich's propaganda might be utterly different from what she had been taught. Back in the camp, the rhythm of daily life pressed on. Each morning the whistle, each roll call, each work detail, but beneath the surface something inside her was shifting. She found herself volunteering more often for the library duty drawn to the shelves, not merely for the photographs in magazines, but for the words themselves. English lessons were posted on the barracks wall, simple lists of vocabulary with translations scrawled beneath. At first she resisted. To learn the enemy's language was treason. Yet one evening she picked up a leaflet and traced the words with her fingerbread, Kleb water voda, freedom sloboda. The connections startled her. It was as though the Americans were trying to speak to her directly, cutting through the fog of ideology with the simplest, most human of needs. Other women embraced the lessons openly. Zuzana, ever bold, carried a small notebook where she wrote down phrases she overheard from guards. Thank you, she practiced rolling the syllables awkwardly. Maria shushed her, terrified that such eagerness would mark them as collaborators. But when the guard chuckled and gently corrected her pronunciation, something in Zuzana's face lit up. It was not surrender, Maria realized. It was discovery. The camp newspaper appeared soon after. Written partly by POWs, it included short articles, poems, even cartoons. Some mocked camp life, others described events in Europe, One headline reported the devastation of Dresden, another carried word of Nuremberg trials. Reading those stories sent tremors through the barracks. They had been told that Germany's cause was noble, that the Reich would endure for 1,000 years. Now they saw photographs of cities reduced to ashes, leaders on trial for crimes unspeakable. Maria wanted to look away. Instead, she studied each image, her throat tightening. If this was true, then what else had been false? Films were shown in the recreation hut once a week. Newsreels flickered across the screen, American soldiers liberating camps, cheering crowds in Paris, families celebrating victory. For the first time, Maria saw footage of skeletal prisoners behind barbed wire in places like Buchenwald. The images turned her stomach. She had heard whispers dismissed them as enemy lies. Yet here it was undeniable. She felt a crack open inside her chest, a deep fault line running through every certainty she had clung to. Music filled the camp too. A phonograph in the mess hall played American swing records. At first the rhythms grated on her ears, too brash, too frivolous. But after weeks she found her foot tapping beneath the table without permission. One evening she caught herself humming along to a tune she did not know the words to. Susanna laughed, nudging her side. "You are becoming an American." Maria flushed red, denying it hotly. Yet the melody stuck in her head for days. Not everyone succumbed. Some of the women remained fiercely loyal to old beliefs. They gathered in corners whispering that the Americans were poisoning them with kindness, that every book, every film, every smile was a weapon more insidious than bullets. One night a woman named Eleanor confronted Maria directly. "You smile too much," she hissed. "You look like one of them. Don't forget who you are." Maria wanted to argue, to insist she had not forgotten. But in her heart she felt the sting of truth. She was changing whether she admitted it or not. The turning point came when Mrs. Miller, the farmer's wife, visited the camp under supervision. She brought recipes written in neat cursive asking if the Slovak women might share their own dishes. Zuzana eagerly described brinzové halushki potato dumplings with sheep cheese. Maria stood silent, torn between pride and suspicion. But when Mrs. Miller pressed a recipe for cinnamon bread into her hand smiling, she felt tears threaten. That scrap of paper felt more dangerous than any rifle. It spoke of a shared humanity that could not be undone by borders or uniforms. In her private notebook, Maria scribbled a question that burned in her mind. If this was a lie, what else had been a lie? She listed them one by one. That Americans were brutal savages. That captivity meant starvation. That kindness was weakness. Each claim unraveled before her eyes. The list ended with a blank line, one she dared not fill. That our cause was just. The guilt weighed heavy. She dreamed of her mother gaunt from hunger, rebuking her for eating sweet rolls in an enemy's church. She awoke in the dark heart, racing ashamed of her appetite. Yet the memory of warmth of shared song returned each time. She could not silence it. One afternoon, sitting by the stove in the barracks, she confided in her diary, "I fear mercy more than cruelty. Cruelty I could resist. Mercy I cannot explain." Writing the words felt like betrayal, yet it also felt like truth. The more she learned, the heavier her silence became. She began to speak English haltingly with guards, asking for books, thanking cooks. Each word tasted forbidden, but each word also expanded the walls of her world. The camp no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a threshold. Beyond it lay questions she had never dared to ask. By winter's end, the ideological scaffolding that had once propped her life was collapsing. She no longer knew what was true or false, only that the certainties of propaganda had dissolved like sugar in coffee. And in that collapse, frightening though, it was she glimpsed something else, the possibility of a new self, one not chained to lies. Yet with possibility came torment. For to step forward meant leaving behind not just falsehood, but also loyalty, memory, identity itself. She carried the weight of her homeland in every heartbeat, even as her tongue learned new words. Her hands turned the pages of English books. Her ears absorbed melodies once forbidden. Every day she lived in conflict, guilt and gratitude, suspicion and longing. And every day the balance shifted ever so slightly toward the dangerous truth that kindness had revealed. Spring of 1946 arrived with mud and thaw. The camp that had been both cage and sanctuary prepared for closure. Notices were read aloud, prisoners would be repatriated to Europe. Some cheered, eager to return to families, to homeland, to anything familiar. Others fell silent, staring at the ground. Maria felt a strange ache in her chest. She had longed for freedom, yet the thought of leaving Iowa, of leaving the strange mercy she had tasted, filled her with dread. The journey home was the reverse of capture, but transformed by memory. Trains rattled eastward across the continent, carrying women who had gained weight, who no longer coughed from hunger, who had notebooks filled with English words. Maria clutched her own small diary pages, crammed with phrases, recipes, half-formed prayers. When the ship finally carried them back across the Atlantic, she stood at the rail watching the silhouette of the American coast recede. She told herself she was leaving only a prison behind, yet what she felt was something closer to loss. In Bratislava, the shock struck harder than she had braced for. The city bore scars deeper than any she had seen in photographs. Streets once familiar were cratered, houses blackened, bridges twisted like broken toys. Children scavenged through rubble for coal. People queued for bread that never seemed enough. The air reeked of smoke and despair. She searched for her family. Her father was gone dead in the last battles. Her cousin had vanished. Her mother survived gaunt and lined her hands, shaking as she embraced her daughter. For a moment, tears drowned all else. Then almost immediately came the questions. Where had she been? What had the Americans done to her? At first she tried to tell fragments. That she had lived. That she had eaten. That she had not been starved or beaten. Her mother listened with disbelief, then fear. Neighbors leaned closer, their eyes narrowing. Soon whispers spread, collaborator traitor, softened by the enemy. The cruelest rumor claimed that the Americans had used the women for pleasure. Nothing she said could silence it. Silence became her defense. The new authorities brought their own weight. Czechoslovakia was being reshaped by politics, the air thick with suspicion. Interrogators summoned returning POWs demanding statements. Some women were forced to sign papers denouncing others. Maria learned quickly that the safest truth was none at all. She described life in the camp as dreary food, as meager guards, as harsh. No one dared contradict her. The cinnamon rolls, the church hymns, the kindness of families like the Millers, these she buried deep inside. But memory would not vanish. Each morning, as she queued for black bread rationed by the state, the smell of coffee rose unbidden in her mind. When she closed her eyes, she saw steam rising from mugs in the Iowa church basement. At night, she dreamed of hymns sung in 2 languages, the harmony echoing through her bones. Waking, she felt both shame and longing. Years passed. The Iron Curtain hardened. Talking about the West became dangerous. Yet in secret on feast days, Maria performed a ritual. She boiled water until it smelled faintly of coffee, though real beans were scarce. She sweetened it with beet sugar when she could find any. From scraps of flour she tried to bake rolls, shaping them into spirals, dusting them with cinnamon when it was available on the black market. The taste was never quite the same, yet as she bit into them she felt for an instant the warmth of that Iowa basement, the laughter of American children, the quiet nod of a pastor who had treated her not as an enemy but as a soul. These rituals were her secret sacrament. She never spoke of them to neighbors, not even to her mother. To admit that her best memory of dignity came from a prison camp in America would have branded her a traitor. Instead, she lived outwardly like everyone else, weary, cautious, silent. Inside, she carried the paradox that captivity had saved her life, while freedom had crushed it with hunger and suspicion. Decades later, as Europe shifted again, she still kept the notebook from camp. Its pages were yellowed, the pencil smudged, but the words endured: bread, chleb, freedom, sloboda, mercy, milost. She traced them with trembling fingers, whispering them like prayers. In the margin was a recipe written in English cursive cinnamon bread. The letters blurred as tears welled in her eyes. For Maria, release had never truly meant freedom. It meant returning to ruins, to silence, to suspicion. Yet beneath the ashes of home she carried a seed planted in captivity, the knowledge that mercy could exist even between enemies, even behind barbed wire. It was a secret that sustained her in years of cold politics and rationed hunger. And though she could never tell it aloud, she knew that morning in Iowa, with the church bell ringing and coffee steaming, had marked the true end of her war. In the hush of later years, when the memories of battles and rubble began to blur, one image endured in Maria's mind: a steaming mug of coffee, the flicker of a church candle reflected in its surface. She had been taught to expect the lash to brace, for cruelty to believe that an enemy's hand would always strike. Instead, she had been offered bread warmth and the space to kneel in prayer beside strangers. The shock of that mercy had cut deeper than any weapon, not because it wounded, but because it healed in ways she had been told were impossible. Looking back, she saw the irony with bitter clarity. She had feared American rifles. What she should have feared was American kindness. For kindness demanded an answer, challenged every belief she had carried into captivity. In the camp, she had discovered that hunger could be satisfied, that dignity could be restored, that even a prisoner's soul could be treated with respect. And once she had tasted mercy in the form of a cinnamon roll shared across enemy lines, she could never wholly believe in hatred again. Her story asked a question that outlived the war: if mercy could exist inside barbed wire, if strangers could share a hymn and a meal across the divide of nations, what else might have been possible all along? The war had ended in fire, and in ruin, yet in that small church basement in Iowa, she had glimpsed something stronger than fear. A quiet truth that even in humanity's darkest hour kindness could still break through.